make a couple brief remarks this evening about some, I think, interesting questions that are raised by certain scientific advances about our brains, with techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging and whatnot. I think we're starting to learn more and more about that, black box between our ears and exactly how it works. And because of these advances, there's this one picture of what our brains might be like that might start to become more and more inescapable as we learn more and more details about how it actually works. The basic picture would be that the brain is some kind of realization of deterministic neural processes, possibly punctuated by various random events. And one of the things I wanted to talk about this evening, the main thing this evening, is how this picture might affect, assuming it keeps fleshing out, how we think about legal punishment. So how might it affect that? Well, generally speaking, stepping back, when we think about legal punishment in general, there are two kind of major approaches that people take toward thinking about legal punishment and justifying it, saying, why do we punish people? Why do we punish that person more than that person, and so forth? And one of these approaches is sometimes called the utilitarian approach, or utilitarianism. And the utilitarian is going to do things like emphasize deterrence, emphasize possibly rehabilitation, emphasize incapacitation. It's forward-looking. The idea is that these are various reasons why it's justified for us to punish people. And the other side of the coin, the other major view, is sometimes called retributivism. A retributivist is also often going to focus on the central focus will be on this idea of moral desert, right? The idea is it's just wrong to punish somebody more than they deserve to be punished. That places a limit on it, regardless of what the good consequences are. Or, another version, if somebody deserves an amount of punishment, then we have an obligation, right, to make sure that he or she gets it. So these are sort of the two pictures. Now, that neuroscientific picture that was emerging that I talked about before, I think that's going to be placing more and more pressure on that retributivist idea. And the way I think it could be placing more and more pressure on that retributivist idea is by reinvigorating a very, very old philosophical argument. And the very, very old philosophical argument goes something like this. It says, well, look, there are these three things that we definitely don't have any control over at all. Right? One of them is, what was the world like before we were born? Presumably we have no control over that. We have no control over what the ultimate laws of nature are, whatever they may happen to be. And assuming that there are various random events that kind of kick in and maybe sometimes affect things that come after them, certainly we don't control the random events because by definition nothing controls them. They just sort of kind of happen. Right? And so then there's this idea that if these three factors over which we lack complete control, right, determine or necessitate everything that happens afterward, including every detail of every moment of our mental lives, every thought that we entertain, every feeling that we entertain, whether or not we make any logical mistakes when we're thinking through what to do, and whether or not any of those mental states actually result in our performing some kind of an action, right? There's this idea that if we don't control those things, then we don't control, in a sense, what we do, or even why we do it, ultimately, in an ultimate sense. Now, if that's true, right, if that's true and we don't control what we do, right, then the argument goes, well, then it's impossible for us to be morally responsible for what we do. And if it's impossible for us to be morally responsible for what we do, then it's impossible ever to deserve punishment for what we do. Right? And so therefore the whole idea of retributivism goes out the window, and then the idea is that as we're learning more and more about our brains and how they work, this is going to become progressively more inescapable. Right? You can imagine a person who say, strangles his wife. It was an actual case. He claimed he had a cyst in a membrane surrounding his brain that was like commandeering his thought processes. He was sort of like a puppet, right? And the cyst was pulling his strings, and my brain made me do it, and so forth. So basically, this is the problem. And what I just simply wanted to do is to mention, certainly without resolving it, three different ways, we could go. These aren't the only ways we could go, but just to provoke some thinking. So on the one hand, you can sort of go whole hog and say, hey, I'm going to accept this entire scientific picture, just go for it. And I'm also going to accept the fact that retributivism is now completely out the window. It's just false that anyone ever deserves punishment for anything. Now, of course, if you take that route, the challenge is going to be to then have to justify everything in terms of utilitarianism, including, for example, the very fact that we require somebody to even do something before we punish them. Right? A second possibility is to try to have our cake and eat it too, by saying that, well, on the one hand, we accept the science, but on the other hand, somehow we can still be responsible for what we're doing, right, in a way that could warrant some kind of a retributive punishment. But of course, the challenge will be to explain how that could possibly be true. And then the final possibility would be to somehow try to figure out how it might be true that in our brains, right, something other than antecedent events that result in what we do, or other antecedent random events that result in what we do, cause what we do. That is a new form of causation, but of course then the concern might be, boy, that just seems like maybe believing in magic. What we would have to do is formulate hypotheses and be prepared to test those hypotheses against the emerging information we're getting from empirical studies about the brain. Thank you very much.